Now that we have finished talking about mysticism and mental health, we can get down to the business of astrology. And for this evening, we're going to talk about only one thing in astrology.
Did you start your little thing?
What's? Oh, yeah, thanks. We're going to talk only about one thing in astrology. And for some people, it is a difficult thing to understand, but it isn't really difficult. But since there is a lot of confusion about it, we're going to look at it from several different points of view. Now, I tried to keep this very short. I tried to keep it down to 45 minutes, but I ran over a little bit on that because I had all kinds of fun putting the notes together, so it should be a good time. Now, the application of this principle is what we're going to be working on for the next 2 or 3 years, because it's something that's very rich and it has many, many different sides to it. But that's the way life is, and if astrology is going to imitate life, astrology has to be as rich as what it's pointing to, even though astrology is quite abbreviated. So we're going to look at this one idea from several points of view. And for almost all of those points of view, it's going to be pairs, because the concept that we're looking for in astrology is a paired concept. Now, this is something we have looked at. The first part of the pair, or the first pair, is something we've looked at before in the mysticism class. It's a simple, everyday thing. It is driving an automobile. When we're driving an automobile, we can determine how fast we're going to drive. We're going to determine our route and our relationship to other drivers, how we signal, and how we do things like that. All of these things are under our control. When we're driving, there are things we can't control. We can't control the weather or the road conditions, and we can't certainly control the other drivers, at least not ethically. So this is the concept from one point of view. When you're driving a car, you are in direct control. Everything is directly under your volition. Now, the other member of this pair is not so easy to grasp, and it's not so easy to describe. Some people might not even exist that it agrees at all, that it exists. Some people might not agree that it exists at all. It's about the general course of life. For example, some days the general course of life seems horrible. And on those days, nothing seems to go right, no matter how hard one tries. And sometimes when you try harder, things get worse. And that's probably because you're trying to treat the matter directly. Then again, on other days, everything goes right. And for one of those days, there is an old maxim that describes it. God is in its heaven, and all is well. It isn't personal, even though it involves us as individuals and the whole universe. Now, some would say that something like this is a matter of attitude. Some days we have a good attitude and some days we have a bad attitude, and that indicates or affects how we see life as it unfolds. Now, I can't argue with that because from my own self-observation, that is true. But it is not completely true. And it's not all inclusive of the phenomenon that we're talking about. Now, if we're saying it's all a matter of attitude, that is a subjective way of looking at things. What we're interested in with astrology is we're trying to get to a more objective or a universalistic view of attitude. I look good. Again, some would say that a universalistic attitude doesn't really exist. Now, from a mystical aspirant, it is again a matter of experience and observation. If we conduct our lives, which is mostly a matter of how we conduct our consciousness, if we conduct our lives in harmony and what we know intuitively and intellectually to be the laws of the universe, and if we try to fulfill the intent of the universe, we have many more of those God is in its heaven and is all is well days. We do have control over how the way the universe treats us. Now, it's true that we're pretty feeble right now. We're just beginners. It's scant, the control that we have, but it can and it will grow depending on us. If we try to selfishly apply this to have the universe always treat us well, it won't work, because that throws us right back into the personal, individual point of view, and then we no longer relate to the universe as the universe. You understand, in all of this, we're saying that we have a presence that is universal. That though most of our operation is like direct control from working in our personality, we also have a larger and a more relatively indirect control of the cosmos. So that point of view, driving a car being a matter of direct control, and understanding from our life indirect control, we see that there are two ways that the direction of life can take place, or the performance of life can take place. Now, from the viewpoint of spiritual aspiration, it's important that we realize this in our lives. It isn't all a matter of how we conduct ourselves in our personal sphere. That's our first responsibility, but we do have a responsibility from seeing things from a much larger sense. Now, where we're trying to get to in astrology, we know that this same force works astrologically. There is direct or indirect control. Now, metaphysically, in spiritual things, we're aware of this. But the way that direct and indirect control work in astrology, this isn't quite the perfect example. It's just enough to know for our own good as spiritual beings, that we do have some control of the cosmos. So we have to try at least one more analogy to try to get to the astrological point of things. Hopefully it'll bring us better, or to a better understanding. Now, at this point in putting together the notes, I had a hankering for lurid or illicit metaphors from a very questionable source, physics. There is a temptation which is irresistible to some contemporary seekers. That is to appeal to physics to prove their mysticism. In our times especially, it's the big trendy thing. Everybody wants to bring quantum mechanics. That's the holy grail, which is going to prove that mysticism is real in the world, without realizing that trying to do that is trying to prove a greater by means of something that's lesser, because mysticism is so much greater and so far beyond physics that it's there's not even really any comparison. Now, during my life, I have noticed that every time that there is some new speculative advance in physics, it is always hailed, especially by the New Age community, to prove what they believe in. And then in a few decades, it becomes passé, and you don't hear about it anymore. The only way we can prove mysticism is one way, and that is to prove it to ourselves. This is what the alchemists called the great experiment. And that is, if quantum mechanics is about the ethers, not to study quantum physics, which is a very awkward. Feynman, who was a quantum physicist, said it takes us many, many hours of computer time to find out what happens in a millisecond in the movement of a particle. And he says there's something wrong with what we're doing. That's too awkward. It's too indirect. So the best way is to prove it to ourselves by developing etheric vision. Now that's exceedingly difficult, but from every report of it, it's worth every bit of the difficulty. In fact, in resorting to pop science, that may even be detrimental spiritual self-development. It might purloin our faith, and it might lead us down many of the blind alleys that science goes down. So, after all of this jiving of modern physics, I gave in to the temptation, and I probably have to do some kind of a penance for quoting contemporary physics. So we have another pair again. And the first pair of examples, the first part of this pair of examples is not modern at all. Imagine two particles of any kind, pool balls if you like, colliding. If you have such a collision, there is a mutual direct effect of each particle on the others. And that direct effect is measurable by the laws of motion and momentum and things like that. Now, the other member of this pair is from modern physics, and it is from quantum mechanics, to be exact. It is an observed phenomenon, and it is a phenomenon that can be produced. In fact, it has been produced. It's called quantum entanglement. Now, to define quantum entanglement, you have to get entangled into a mass of definitions that are not easy for lay people like me. Quantum entanglement takes place in a quantum state, and a quantum state takes place in a quantum system. So now you're really all clear about all of that. A quantum system is the whole universe, or any part of it, as it is taken into account for complete analysis by its quantum mechanics. And the quantum mechanics is a study of nature by studying the quanta, or the amount of energy, of the smallest particles in nature. Usually, quantum mechanics is applied to atomic or subatomic particles. And a quantum state is just what it says it is. It is a state where energy is happening in this given region of a quantum system. Sometimes the quantum state is called an isolated system because it's isolated from everything else in the universe, which is what the physicists try to do in their laboratories. Now, in such a system, because all of the particles may be in either a wave state or a particulate state, measurement is not exact. So quantum mechanics is a matter of statistics. It's statistical quantum mechanics about where something is going to be and in what state it's going to be in. Now, Einstein didn't like this, and he thought this probabilistic nature was not right. And he made the famous quote, "I don't believe that God is shaking dice." He eventually relented and agreed with some of the ideas of quantum mechanics, but not all of them. Now, quantum entanglement occurs when pairs of particles, or even groups of particles, are generated in such a way that the quantum state of one of them, or of each particle, cannot be described independently of the other, or independently of the others. We'll take a really simple example. This whole view of things is very, very simple. If you have one particle that's in a quantum pair, whether you produce it in a laboratory with some kind of accelerator or something like that, and that one particle is entangled with another one produced at the same time, one atom will spin on a given axis in a given direction, and the entangled particle will, on the similar axis, will be spinning the opposite direction. And this is independent of where they are in the whole matter. Now, if you think of the whole universe as the quantum system, and you think of a pair being produced by something like what physicists like to call the Big Bang, which to me is a very questionable thing, one member of the quantum pair will relate to its quantum partner even if they are at opposite sides of the universe, many, many light years away from each other. This is a mensurable thing according to quantum mechanics. And if you do something to this particle, it will also affect the other particle. So they have an entangled relationship. I've been in entangled relationships, but not quite like that one. Einstein didn't like this idea either. He called it spooky action at a distance. Nonetheless, quantum effects have been produced experimentally. They've been produced in subatomic particles and even atoms themselves, and it gets so much that molecules, and they have produced quantum pairs of diamonds. I don't know how they did it or how the quantum pairs relate to each other, but that they are intimately and inseparably interlocked from each other. Now, in the example we just gave, we talked about spin. It could have been momentum, it could have been polarization, and it could have been any of other list of properties that a quantum particle can have. Now, New Agers like this whole idea of action at a distance because it supports a sensitive etheric universe, which it does. Like when you say something like the Bible says, not a feather can fall off of a bird without affecting the whole universe, or God knows about it. But it's still statistical, the whole overall quality of it all. And that's not exactly how it all happens in the universe. The universe is much more than that. Not the same thing as if you go beyond etheric vision and develop magical powers. You can materialize and dematerialize an object, and there's no doubt because you are in control of it. So it isn't a matter of statistics. But for what we're trying to do, this is a good example of indirect influence versus direct influence, which one would see with the collision of particles. Now, for what we're trying to get at in astrology, there is a different phenomenon that is from physics that works much better. And that example is a particle and a field. Any charged particle has a field. And the particle and the field are intimately intertwined. You can't change the property of a particle without changing the properties of a field. And the same thing happens vice versa. You can't change the properties of a field without changing the properties of a particle. Now, this is a very excellent metaphor for what we're trying to get at in astrology. However, it lacks one thing that is essential to astrology, more of a qualitative thing than a quantitative thing. Astrology is all about character. And character is not just mass and momentum or the charge of a field. So we need one more example. Well, this is going really fast. We're going to be out of here in 45 minutes. The final metaphor that we're going to use comes from that great reservoir of character wisdom, country music. My father, when my mother died, after a few years, he married a woman, and she was into country music. And every time I'd go to visit my father, the country music channel would be on, and you had to listen to it. And there's a hackneyed cliche among the folks that do country music, and they take it really, they cherish it. They have a statement, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. Now, I'm not certain that this is true in full, but in any case, it helps us considerably. What it means to say, I believe, is if someone or some ones have their background imprinted on their character, if that imprint, that character is taken to another environment, it will maintain that character, and just as if it was at home. And you could go even further and say that if that character enters a new environment, it changes that new environment. But what happens then is that the person who does the changing is also changed to some extent, which means to say that that even though some of the character may remain the same in going into another culture, it gets changed by changing the other culture, and the other culture gets changed by it. And you could even go so far as to say that if the country boy or the country girl goes home, they'll change the original environment. This is how culture and character evolve. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower. The people that came here from England early in our country, a lot of them went into the mountains and they lived in an isolated way. And they carried England with them into the mountains. And even though England had evolved, they hadn't. They evolved at a much slower state. Now, this is almost perfect for what we want to study in astrology. In this course, we're going to try to get at character understanding and character appreciation by using the mundane houses as a means to come to an understanding of life and character in the different departments in life and character. Now, for each house in a horoscope, there are two varieties of astrological experience for each and every house. Two possible. These two types of influence are, no surprise, direct and indirect influence. Every house has indirect influence, but only some of the houses have direct influence or influences. If you have a planet that's in a house, that planet has direct influence on the activities and attitudes of that house. But if we count, just using the major astrological significators, there are more houses than there are major significators. So some of the houses have to be empty of major planets. Now, this is consternating to a lot of people who study astrology, especially to newcomers. Newcomers, if they get a horoscope, you can get them made for free on the internet easily, wonder what the empty houses are. Are they of less importance? Are they of less influence? And the answer to that question is sometimes yes and sometimes no. The answer depends on the strength of the different influences, the direct and the indirect influences. the strength of indirect influence can be every bit as strong or stronger than direct influence. Now, what seems to have happened is in modern times, a lot of people studying astrology seem to favor direct influence over indirect influence. Probably it might be due to the fact that it's easy, or it's easier compared to indirect influence. It might also be due to the increased significance of materialism, where we focus on visible things rather than on environments. Now, this hasn't always been the case. Like if you go back just as far as 17th century astrology, like Nicholas Culpeper and William Lilly, they did much more with indirect influences. Now, William Lilly has one of the most famous books in all of astrology. It's called Christian Astrology, A Modern Approach. It was called Christian because it was not fatalistic. At that time, there was a lot of Arabic astrology. And the Arabic astrology was very fatalistic. It is the will of Allah and you can't do anything about it. Whereas Christians had more of the notion of freedom. And so he called his book Christian Astrology, and it's loaded with indirect references. In fact, there's much more done, I think, with indirect references than with direct, though I've never counted. Now, some of the varieties of indirect experience are almost unknown to modern astrology. A lot of those things went by the by, and I don't know whether they're valuable or not. As always, the means of the success in the means of understanding depends on intuition. If we're going to work with astrology using direct influences or indirect influences, the only way we can tell is through intuition. And intuition isn't limited to astrology. Tea leaves, you can read tea leaves, you might get some accurate information, but it's accurate in a small sense in the moment, and it's not very thorough, and it doesn't offer a deep understanding the way astrology does. Intuition and the interpretation of intuition is the all-important factor in the success with working with astrology. There's just too much information and too many unknowns to try to do astrology by knowledge alone. You can't do it. Now, if you practice more astrology, you gain experience, and it's experience that you know works because you got it from yourself. You've observed it and you've lived through it. But it's knowledge. Intuition is not knowledge. And knowledge is always of the past. You don't know that the next case is going to be like it was in the past. Whereas intuition is live and it's always relevant and it's always present right in the now. Now, most astrologers learn direct influences of planets in houses by reading what I call ditty books. Ditty books are those astrological books that give a ditty for different astrological influences. There might be a ditty about the direct influence of Mars in the second house, for example, and that ditty might be a paragraph or it might be several pages long. And it is always what the author of that ditty book has found to be true from practice. But there are only so many authors and so many books when there are so many experiences that, this is pretty limited things. Sometimes the ditties are descriptive and authoritative, and sometimes the ditties are philosophical and ponder things. And sometimes nowadays, the ditties are compilations from a whole number of astrologers by computer. It's a much more elaborate and a much bigger source of knowledge, but it is still just a ditty, and it's not live. Now, I won't say that you can't learn by such a means, because many people do. They arduously, I have one friend that when she was a very young woman, just beyond her teenagers, her friends would ask her about their horoscopes, and she'd have about 8 or 10 books, and she'd look up the meaning in each of those books, and she'd try to synthesize it in her mind. And that, that's the way people learn. And then when you get the experience and see it in your friends, you can see the way it is. I will even go so far as to say that if a person really needs help and they don't know where to go, sometimes if they have very good indirect influence, they can guide themselves to just the right ditty book that they need to, to have their problem solved. It works that way. My personal feeling is that it's much better to work with keyword astrology, because you're doing something and you're putting something of yourself into it. You don't have to use the keywords necessarily to describe the situation, because if you do that, you're merely making a new ditty. But if you're using the keywords, and the keywords are keys to intuition, by going through all sorts of different combinations of keywords, you'll find one that the intuition says, this is where you want to look. Much better way of going about it. Because when the intuition is sparked, then there is relevance. And then when you have the relevant information, whether it's just the facts or just the ideas that you get from putting the keywords together, then you can ponder. And when you ponder, you can come to a much deeper meaning. What's even better is if the astrologer and the person who is working together with the astrologer work back and forth from observation or even with keywords. And when they work back and forth, they can come to an understanding of the situation, because the astrologer knows astrology, but not necessarily the individual. And the individual knows their life and the things that have been happening, and when there's that interface with the astrologer, that is productive of much better understanding. That has probably the highest degree of relevance, because it is the person who is seeking understanding that is the source of most of the information. And if you do things that way, you sidestep the problem of authoritativeness, which is always a problem with astrology. People think that because somebody studied astrology and they take the role of an astrologer, that they are an authority and have an authoritative statement in someone's life. There is some direct influence from the signs occupying houses. Let's try to make some examples here. We just said we had Mars in, what did we say?
Second house.
Yeah, in the second house, but I forgot what sign. I don't know. we had Mars in Capricorn. I'd make this Aquarius, this would be Pisces, this would be Aries. Very rough thing. All right. We're trying to get the indirect influence of the second house. The sign ruling the cusp is Aries, and to understand that or to open up the house, you look to Mars, and that is the way you get to understand. But if most of this house is ruled by Aries, there is some direct influence just from the Aries nature itself. But that is sign influence, and it is not planet influence. And sign influence is much more nebular. And the signs need foci in order to express. And the planets are the foci. And so even though there's some direct influence from Aries, the focal point or the focusing agency of the Aries energies would be found with Mars. All right. So again, this is like a field. A sign energy is like a field of Aries qualities, which are martial qualities. Now, indirect influence, as we said earlier, applies to every house, whether the house is occupied by a planet or not. Let's just say in our example here, there are no planets in the second house. It's an empty house. The indirect influence will work anyway. This is similar to quantum entanglement, because whatever happens to Mars affects what happens to wherever Aries is located. Could even be some of Aries in the first house and some in the second house. And if anything happens to Mars, it'll affect this entire area, but especially the cusp, the first cusp that is ruled by Mars. Usually, except in the case if a planet is in its rulership, and even then it's not a certain thing, indirect influence is applied from a distance. It's that same kind of spooky action at a distance. If a planet's in its ruling sign, and it is in the house that it is, that is, like if we put Mars here, in Aries, then Mars would have both direct and indirect influence, and Mars would be exceedingly strong. But that can only happen when a planet is in its own sign. And the reason for that is influence, indirect influence is based exclusively on planetary rulerships. This means that rulerships, or rulership, which is sometimes called essential dignity and sometimes just called dignity, is the most important astrological relationship with relation to the houses. Now, there are analogies in this to statecraft. It used to be that the tone of the state was set by the king. As the king went, so did the state. And the people followed in the image of the king. With the rise of democracy, it has come to be the other way around. The people have more to say about the tone of the country, and they even choose who the ruler is that's going to represent them. Now, in order for a state to be a state, it has to have sovereignty. And one of the definitions of sovereignty is a state has to be able to defend itself and to maintain itself. If it can't, it's not sovereign. It's a slave state or a puppet state or something like that. Therefore, if one is strong enough to rule, one is then a sovereign. And only the strongest one can represent a state. And what we're saying here by this is that the strongest relationship of Aries to any planet is with its ruler, because it's sovereign and the ruler has the strength to maintain that sovereignty. The sun is exalted there, but the sun is not the strongest there. If it were, it would be the ruler, and it isn't the ruler. And this is something that every astrologer in the Western world has found to be true. There have been some strange astrological views, but deviation from the dignity of planets and house rulership has not been one of them. The house rulership, the house ruler relationship to the house function is easy to state, but it's not always easy to synthesize. That's where you have to mix all these things together. This is the definition of it, as simple as can be. This is the basis of almost all Western astrology. The planet ruling the sign on the first cusp of a house is the ruler of the house. The planet ruling the sign on the first cusp of a house is the ruler of the house. One more time, because it's really important. The planet ruling the sign on the cusp of a house is the ruler of the house. Now that's true even if it is the last degree or two. This means that the first cusp of a house is extremely important. And this means that accuracy of a horoscope is important. If you're off by 15 minutes or something like that, a cusp might have changed signs, and if you try to get at the meaning of that house, you will not be able to do so. And this brings up another difficult thing, house systems. If you cast a horoscope, you can do it. There are a number of sites there on the internet. You can cast a horoscope for the same time in the same place using several different house systems. The ascendant and midheaven will be basically the same no matter what house system you use. There are some exceptions to that. But some of the cusps in between may differ. And this is because there are different mathematical systems for dividing houses. And every generation has their own reason for choosing their own favorite, which is basically to differentiate themselves from the generation that came before. It's a matter of fad. Now, I would gladly go into the philosophy of house systems if there were sufficient interest to do so. But it's a hairy kind of project, and I'd have to do all kinds of work, and I don't think most people would really be interested in it anyway. Perhaps sometime later. For these talks, we're going to use Placidus houses, and I'll offer the reason why if anyone's interested in that. If there is close timing and you don't know whether one sign is on the cusp or another sign is on the cusp, by observation, you can sometimes correct. You can sometimes correct because my experience is, and the way I understand it is, no system of dividing houses works. Each, for a whole bunch of reasons, none of them completely works. And people who are adherents of one system or another would be outraged by this because they feel that they have the truth on this and nobody else does. But they don't, and I can show you why. Okay, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. No matter what sign and what house a planet is in, it will be carrying the relationship of its sign or signs of rulership. No matter what sign and house a planet is in, it will bear the character of its sign or signs of rulership. In this case, Mars will have the character of Aries, no matter whether it's in the 11th house or the 10th house or anywhere else or any other sign of the zodiac. The basic relationship of rulership will carry all the way through. Mars will always be Mars. Now this means, for one thing, what happens in a sign will change the influence of a planet. Suppose there was an eclipse of the sun in Aries. That would affect Mars. It would affect Mars, and it would affect the 11th house, and it would even affect Capricorn, because you have this relationship that you took the boy out of the country, but the boy is going to influence wherever he is at, and whatever happens back home is going to influence him. It's just that, all right. Now, this is like entanglement. Entanglement is a two-way street. This means that whatever happens to Mars will also affect the second house. Meaning to say that suppose Saturn comes along by transit and sits right on Mars, that will affect the second house. It may mean a limitation of funds or something like that, or at least not as wild a spending as normal. Aries on the cusp of the second house is sometimes a pretty free spender. So it's a two-way street. So when you're working with indirect influences, it becomes very complicated. You have to understand how the planet affects the sign that it rules and the house or houses that it rules. And you have to understand how the house and houses that it rules affect the planet and the things that are considered where the planet is located directly. This means a lot of synthesis. It means you have to put a lot of things together, which is why we're going to go so tediously slow with this part of the class. This is meant to be a complicated thing. We're going to try, we're going to deal with the more difficult things of astrology in this series. So we're going to try to get to do a lot of this synthesis. For now, we'll try to keep it as simple as possible. We'll say, as we did in the very first introductory course, that houses are fields of mundane opportunities. Second house that we just looked at would be the opportunity to make money, or to take on responsibility, or to have quality products, All of those are possible second house meanings. If we're trying to understand the houses are like the rooms in a house. You do things in different rooms of the house. You do your recreation in the den, and you sleep in the bedroom. And if you have a mansion, you have the grand ball in the ballroom and things like that. The first cusp on a house, in this case here, the first cusp of a house is like the door to the room of that house is. Before you can enter that room, we're talking about in your consciousness now, and know what it is like, you have to be able to open the door. And the key to the door is the planet that rules the sign on the cusp. So the ruler of the cusp is much more important than a key, because it not only opens it, it gives tone and it gives quality. If there's a planet inside of the house, suppose the moon is inside of the house and suppose it's in Taurus, the moon is like the washing machine. And if you want to use the washing machine, before you can use it, you got to get in. And so to get in, you have to understand the contingency that is Mars. And that is the way the indirect rulership works. Now, next time, we'll start getting into some of the technicalities of this, and we're going to try to do something that is insanely difficult, and we're going to say right off the bat that we're not going to be completely successful. And the next time we meet for the astrology will be 3 weeks from tonight, because next week the philosophy class will meet, the mystical philosophy will meet, and then I'm going to be gone for the Thursday after that. Yes?
Question regarding exaltation.
Yes.
Okay. There are many schools of thought that talk about the sun being exalted and stronger in Aries. Okay?
Yeah.
I accept the fact that Mars rules Aries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if you've been using examples in quantum mechanics,
Mm-hmm.
I'll use the example of King Arthur and Lancelot.
Mm-hmm.
King Arthur ruled,
Mm-hmm.
but Lancelot was the strong one.
Mm-hmm.
And if the sun were in Aries in that, the sun would probably be stronger than Mars, but it would have to obey what Mars, it would take on the characteristics of Mars.
I don't know that. I don't know that. My experience with exaltations is it might be very strong, but it is in a specialized area. An exaltation is a specialization.
I agree.
So if you have something like a mountain lion, the mountain lion might be most at home and it might rule when it's the same color as the rocks in the mountain. But if you put him in the swamp, that's going to be his detriment. Doesn't like the water. And there may be some places like if things are too green, his color will stand out and that would be like the fall. But if he's in an area where he can leap from trees or something like that, then a special quality comes out. And what I have found with exaltations is that it is a special strength and not a general strength. And I would say that the special quality of the sun in Aries would be vitality, but not the overwhelming heat and manifestation of power that it has when it is in Leo. So it's only a special matter.
I understand that, but what I was getting at is it would almost have to have the fact that it is in a very assertive home, basically in Aries, its strength there would be exalted based on where it is. You know? You don't want to say for sure, you can't.
No, what I want to say is that kings don't have to assert themselves just by the majesty of their power. If they have to assert themselves, there's sort of weakness in that. So I don't agree with that analogy. But in what we're talking about here is a pure condition that doesn't exist in nature. The stronger planet between the Sun and Mars might be, if the Sun is unaspected in Aries and Mars is super strong in some other sign, Mars is going to be the stronger planet. It's going to have control all kinds of aspects and things like that. So if we get into a discussion about which one is stronger, it doesn't work that way. Yeah. Okay.
What did you mean when you said doing keyword astrology?
There are certain, I have a whole book of it, and we spent 3 years on it. It's where there are certain keywords that are associated with houses and with signs and with planets and with aspects. And you look at a combination, let's say in this case here, let's say Mars is trine the moon. So you would put the keywords of Mars in the 11th house and Capricorn together, and you would put the trine keywords, and you'd keep making different combinations of sentences until you got one that struck your intuition. And when you got that way you have live information, and you have information that you know is true because intuitively you can see it in your life. And then when you know that, then you can ponder it. Yeah. Okay. Scott says this is all too much technical astrology for me. Well, thank you very much.